Okay. If that's okay for you, I'm gonna just go to the next part. So the next part, we've seen the evaluation criteria to ensure that we have good quality carbon projects. Now we're gonna have a look at how are these requirements carried out in practice, and are there any requirements on the finances part? And so you're going to see that there is a whole range of standards and guidelines that emerged to regulate these carbon markets. So I will start just with a few facts. So there is no international regulatory governance for voluntary carbon markets. So in most places, you can do whatever you want so far, and it's changing. This is what I'm going to show you. But just to give you an idea, so yeah, I'm using this supply and demand thing. The demand would be the side of the finances, and supply would be about the carbon offer, the carbon credit offer. So on the demand side, what we're seeing in practice is that everybody is net zero. Everybody has made commitments about net zero, and this is something that is being tracked by the net zero tracker. And so each year we do have a bigger number of big companies that are positioning themselves as on a net zero trajectory. But what this net zero tracker shows is also that usually it's not enough to say that you're net zero. And this is there is usually a poor quality of the commitments. And in particular, the commitments might be just on scope 1 and 2, but not the whole indirect emissions. There might be no intermediary targets. So it's like, okay, we'll be net zero in 2050, but just what do you do before that? So yeah, the commitments are usually of poor quality, and there is an enormous confusion on how to use carbon credits. So most of these commitments do not say if they use carbon credits to actually reach this net zero, to what extent, what kind of credits are they planning to buy, with what kind of requirements, and so on. So there is a lot to clarify on that. Although, once again, the companies that are buying carbon credits are not the worst in terms of mitigation, far from that. And then on the supply side, you just have the same. So you have all kind of projects and operators that say that they sell carbon credits, but then you may have everything and anything behind this carbon credits name. So you do have really varying levels of quality, and yeah, so on the different requirements that we have mentioned before. But there are some guiding principles behind those supply and demand side that are here to actually support the integrity of the markets. So on the demand side, so for the finances, the idea is that if you're a financer, your strategy should include this sequence of actions. First, you should measure your emissions, avoid emissions, reduce them. This is what we call in French, mesurer, éviter, réduire, compenser. This whole sequence was, there was a lot of communication on that. And so this trajectory of mitigating your own emission should be compatible with a plus 1.5 degree trajectory. And then, only then, the higher point 2, then you could contribute, offset, or finance projects beyond your value chain. And I'm going to come back on how you call this kind of approaches. But yeah, so the idea is that first you reduce, and then you can commit to finance something else. other than new projects. Then on the supply side, so on the credits, the carbon credits should respect the whole set of criteria that we have been detailing before that. So I'm not going to come back on that. So then, just so I said that for the finances, you have to measure, avoid, reduce, and then offset or contribute to carbon neutrality, contribute to net zero, and so on. And this is a notion that has been emerging for the last years. So a few years back, we could consider that carbon neutrality and net zero were really considered equivalent. But progressively, some standards, voluntary standards, introduced a distinction between the two. And yeah, so since 2015, there was this nuance that was introduced, that there might be a different temporality between carbon neutral and net zero, and that they might imply also a different use of carbon finance. One that would be buying beyond value chain emission reductions and removal, and one that would be exclusively buying removals. So net zero can be considered as a future claim for companies, a future claims. That means that in 2050, you commit to have, and you should have, so your emission reduction trajectory that includes all your scopes, 1, 2, 3. And then that's once you reach this level that you actually reduce by 90% your emissions with this residual emissions, you should neutralize them either by buying removal credits, carbon removal credits, or by creating removals on your own value chain. So this is the column on the right. And so this is this triangle that you can see that would be the neutralization of residual emissions in the future to reach a net zero state. And then carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality would be different in a way that it can be understood as a claim at the present moment, which means also that you have the same emission reduction trajectory, but what you call your residual emission, this is not the residual emission that you have in 2050, but each year's residual emission on your 3 scopes can be subject to, you can buy credits to compensate them, to offset them. Yeah, so this is why you might find some actors, some finances that only want to buy removals because they are actually with this definition of a net zero for future, so looking for neutralization of 2050 emissions, and some others that, I mean, for them it's equal to buy emission reduction credits or removals if they're more in this carbon neutrality vibe. But this is a theoretical nuance and conceptualization, because if you look in practice, you do have a lot of companies that use them completely in an indifferent way. But since the SBTi, so Science-Based Target Initiatives, started to use this net zero terminology, this is the kind of use of carbon credits that is also developing with this initiative. So this is a non-exhaustive list of voluntary guidelines for carbon neutrality and net zero. So you have international ones, and I've put a few French ones at the bottom. So this is just to show you that these voluntary guidelines, they're numerous. They don't always have the same scope. So you might have some guidelines that explain to you, okay, how should you reduce? How should you make your mitigation trajectory for your organization? How should you measure your emission reductions? How should you report on them? And another part of the recommendations, but not in all guidelines, they may help you on how to use carbon credits to finance mitigation beyond your value chain. They may help you with communication claims, and they may also make recommendations on the quality of the carbon credits. So the scopes are not the same. They do not always overlap. They might combine with each other. You might have one guideline that actually refers to SBTI, like to do the mitigation trajectory, you should look for SBTI and so on. You have really different levels of precisions, and sometimes the recommendation might compete with each other. So it's really impossible to compare them directly. And again, these are voluntary. Like no one is actually obligated to follow those guidelines. But they have common features. For example, they all say that you should prioritize your own reduction mitigation over financing beyond your value chain or offsetting, contributing, however, whatever you call it. That your emission reductions should be on all the scopes of your organization, not only the 1 and 2. That there should be a precise and regular reporting of these emission reductions. And on this financing part that we can call beyond value chain mitigation, like SBTI does, you should be funding on the widest scope possible. So just not like you're not contributing to 2 tons beyond your value chain. That you should have carbon credits with a certain level of quality. It comes back to the criteria we have detailed before, and you should have a careful communication, and especially a proportionate communication. You shouldn't say that you're neutral, positive, and so on, because this is the kind of communication that is currently happening. And then I'm just going to look closer at 3 of these guidelines that really pave the way on the voluntary carbon markets. Although, again, they have no legal or regulatory role. They are purely voluntary. So SBTI, so the Science-Based Target Initiative, it was launched in 2015 by some civil society organizations. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Global Compact, World Resource Institute, and WWF. And their idea at the beginning is to provide guidance for companies to define their net zero trajectory on the whole value chain in a way that is compatible with the plus 1.5 scenario. So it's really not at the beginning about how to finance beyond your value chain. It's really about giving a sectoral methodology on how much should you reduce your emissions and how fast. In 2022, they have published their methodology for the forest, land, and agriculture sector. This is the FLAG methodology. But then they also started, on top of these sectoral methodologies, to develop what they call a net zero standard. The idea is, on top of your own mitigation, beyond that, how should you contribute to finance beyond your value chain some mitigation efforts? And so far, there is a standard, but it's really unclear. And the recommendations are really like soft, and it doesn't really help to know what you do. But what you have to keep in mind is that once they will publish something that is more precise, it will probably have some important authority on this voluntary carbon market. Yeah, and just to give you an idea, so far I think there are like more than 2,000 companies that have validated SBTI trajectories, because SBTI offers to validate them. And it's really growing fast, and I think that most of these companies are in Europe. Then another guidelines, voluntary guidelines. This is the one from VCMI. VCMI is the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. This is a lot more recent. It was created in 2021 by it's funded by major philanthropy foundations like Rockefeller, Bezos, Packard, and Google. And so they have just published in 2023 their final requirements on offsetting approach. So their idea is to value and to promote the commitment of companies that are going to finance carbon credits beyond their value chain. So they have this kind of labels that they call silver, gold, and platinum. And so the idea is to say, okay, how much do you finance beyond your value chain? And the first level, the first step, silver, is if you do buy carbon credits that are equivalent to 10% of your emissions from scope 1, 2, 3 together. So that might seem quite low. You might say, okay, that's like, isn't it supposed to be 100%, like in the graphs that I was showing, like the 100% of your residual emissions? Yeah, it's slow to say it's 10%, but the number that we have is that currently on the voluntary carbon market, the buyers do buy credits that are equivalent to, on average, 2% of their emissions from scope 1, 2, and 3. So they already set the bar higher than that. And then, and actually, yeah, there is a big question on how many companies are actually going to be able to reach these labels. Then on the supply side, so you have, this is also an integrity initiative. So this is the ICVCM, Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, created the same year, 2021. They gather all kind of actors from the certification, carbon certification ecosystem. And they established a framework to assess the quality of the carbon credits. So they used the same quality criteria that I detailed before, measurability, permanence, additionality, and so on. They just call it another way. They call it Core Carbon Principle, CCP. And so they have this whole grid that is a bit more detailed. This goes beyond the principle of it, and they are starting to operationalize it. So it's been like 2 years that they're preparing the grid, and now at the beginning of 2024, we should know like the first batch of credits that will actually be approved as CCP credits, like that means quality credits. And so just to give you an idea, there is a first estimate by a company that is called Trove Research that possibly there would be less than 20% of the projects, existing projects on voluntary carbon market that would pass the bar, that would actually be compatible with this CCP criteria. So what you can see with these voluntary guidelines is that there is a whole process of like putting out those who do wrong and trying to promote and value those that are like following the rules on this voluntary markets. But there are still multiple guidelines, yeah, as I was saying, with different scopes, criteria, and different level of recognition. But there is no international regulation. In most countries, there is no regulation at all on those voluntary carbon markets, and France is an exception. And anyway, there is no penalty system if someone uses another terminology or anything like that for now. Because, yeah, so the voluntary guidelines, they can't do everything. They can't just do the whole thing. So there are legislations that are emerging. There are regulatory frameworks, especially in the European Union. We do have 2 directives that are actually being negotiated now. The Empowering Consumer in the Green Transition Directive and the Green Claims Initiative Directive. So, empowering consumers in empowering consumers, the directive is like a generic, as this is like a framing law, and then Green Claims Initiative is like a more operational one. So what is it? So empowering consumers, the idea is about banning the vague and generic environmental claims unless the company can actually prove that they have an excellent environmental performance. So the idea is really say that now it's for the companies to have, the companies have to prove their excellent performance. It's not that the customers would have to guess it or to demonstrate that they're doing wrong and so on. So it changes like the sense of the proof. And then one measure that was especially communicated on in the media was the ban on carbon neutral products. So the exact thing is that it bans carbon neutral claims on products when these claims are based on the purchase of carbon credits. And so, but this is really partial because it only says, okay, we're going to prohibit that on products, but then what do you do with companies? What do you do with services and so on? So, I mean, that's a first block about how should we use these environmental claims, but it's not enough for climate claims at least. And then in this second initiative, the Green Claims Initiative, there are some really interesting measures that are to come. For example, the fact that to limit environmental claims, there might be an obligation of an ex-ante verification of the claim. So you would only be able to claim an environmental aspects of your product if it had been checked like before. So, and you have a whole thing about regulating environmental labels so that new ones you cannot create like any environmental label like that will make things a lot more complicated. And there are a few measures again that are on climate claims, but they are really light. They only say that you will need to publish some information if you make climate and offsetting claims, like distinguish between what are your own emissions and what are you buying as carbon credits. That's quite obvious. Then you should communicate on the activity that is generating the credits to say if it's a removal or an emission reduction, and you should communicate on the methodologies that were used to guarantee the carbon credit integrity. Well, this is most probably not enough to guarantee that. So, but it's also really useful for other aspects of environmental claims. So I guess we can imagine that later on, after those directives, we might have something that is more focused on climate and offsetting claims, because so far it's really light. And then I'm not gonna go into details with that, but France has actually regulated carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality claims, at least for products and services, and the use of its label by carbon credits. So we had three texts, the legislative text in 2022, that actually detailed some obligations, some requirements when you buy credits and whenever you claim carbon neutrality on products. So on the supply side, they were obligations about the credits being measurable, permanent, verified, additional, and so on. But you see, these very credits are not mentioned so far in the European legislation. So, and then on the demand side, you also had some interesting requirements, like some transparency on funding, saying how much did you pay for the credits, and having like a detailed demonstration of your mitigation trajectory for your company. So yeah, this is just an example, but part of this regulation is going to become obsolete with the European level, and especially the regulation on carbon neutral claims for products and services, because so far the European Union is going to prohibit the claim of carbon neutrality on products. So France won't be able to go on like detailing the obligations. It's just going to be banned anyway. Yeah, so competing in a way regulation, but so far little regulation actually. Yeah, here are a few studies about that. Do you have any questions on these integrity guidelines? There are numerous and not always coherent. No questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, the not. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, yeah, just a question there on the voluntary frameworks. Don't mean to annoy you on this one, but some of our stakeholders would probably see this as probably voluntary markets or voluntary carbon markets, with all the work and effort going into them, as being something that will be a requirement in the future. So I guess, do you have any comments around that, or how likely that is to happen? And then a follow-on question is, if I can remember right, I think you mentioned in the history lesson that some of the credits from the voluntary market have been sold or used in the compliance market. How did that work, or how are they valued, or could you give maybe an example of that as well? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, but actually I'm going to answer it in the next part. So I do have some examples of voluntary credits used in compliance, and then what is voluntary for now and probably going to be a regulatory requirement in some time. So
Okay,